Good morning. Can you hear me okay? All right. It's a real pleasure to be here with you folks. We've had a chance a few times to worship with you and for some of your prayer meetings in previous years. My name, of course, is David Miller, as he pointed out, and I had my roots actually about 10 miles from Oklahoma over in a state called Texas. Wichita Falls was where I grew up. And anyway, you know, Texans weren't famous for having humility. You heard them say that they always talked about the stories of how Texas was bigger and better. My brother Mark still lives down in Central Texas. He said he saw someone with one of those shirts that said, "I wasn't born in Texas, but I got here as quick as I could." You know, and so you kind of get the idea that sometimes that pride is one of the things the Lord has to work on to help us. So anyway, I told my wife, who was a native Tulsa girl, and she went to TAA and so forth, and we're actually still members of the church there where we got married, and she was baptized, and I think this morning she was involved with the online Sabbath school, so she wasn't able to come with me. But she and I met there at our college in Texas, and we got married. And I guess this next week we're going to have our 49th anniversary, so we're real thankful for having these Oklahoma girls that we can meet down there at our college. And so some of our colleagues, some of you are probably familiar with, actually their paths kept them in this area. Dr. Fortner was the best man in our wedding back. Some of you probably met him, and Dr. Corrigan was one of my chemistry teachers when I was, or actually lab instructors when I was there at the college. And so anyway, we have our roots definitely in the Southwest. I had the privilege of going through my education, you might say. I felt like I was a blessing to me because I had the privilege of having a mother who was a believer, parents that had come into the church from various backgrounds. But anyway, she was my first educator, and then I had the chance to go to our little one-horse church school, as my dad called it, there in Wichita Falls. And then we even had a little junior academy for a little while before I went to Chisholm Trail Academy. And then after the college time, spent time at Loma Linda University in the School of Medicine from 1974 to 1977. Then we went to take some time in a family practice residency at Florida Hospital for about 15 months before we felt the call, even though we were on a deferred mission appointment, to go to back to Japan, where I'd spent a year as a student missionary with the General Conference. It seemed like the Lord kind of moved our hearts to instead go to far eastern Alabama, where we spent about 25 years as volunteers working in a little self-supporting institution called Uchee Pines Institute. Some of you have probably heard of that place. How many have ever heard of Uchee Pines? Before I see several hands. And so during those years, of course, it helped give me an opportunity and some insights and an opportunity to be exposed to the unique concepts of healthful living that the Lord has put in the hands of Seventh-day Adventists to be a blessing to the world. And so during those years, it certainly helped shape, the philosophy of health and so forth that I presently have. After we left Uchee Pines in 2004, I spent 5 years working with Dr. Neil Nedley in his office, and it kind of was quite an adjustment to move back into a clinic setting and ICU setting and helping him with patient care there, primarily for those 5 years. And then Dr. Emerson had worked at the Lifestyle Center of America and was going to be taking a kind of a mission appointment, you might say, to go to Eden Valley Institute, and was praying the Lord would send somebody that was from the lifestyle orientation to help with his practice that he had there, where the old Adventist hospital was, right there, and had it set up already. And so we took over his practice for the last 5 years, and about 40% of his practice were diabetics and so forth. That gave us a chance to certainly give a lot of lifestyle-oriented education to some folks certainly in need of help in these days. So anyway, that gives you a little background. Then we moved up to look after family members these last few years, and are actually in the same home over in Rogers County, not too many miles, about 18 minutes away or so from here, down where Judy grew up as a kid. So anyway, I guess we've made our circle, and seems like the mission field of Oklahoma is still a good place to be, and I appreciated the sharing this morning and your personal ministry's time of how we can think of ways to plant seeds and that can sprout. We never know what a kind word or a tract in somebody's hand could do, and especially in the times we live in now. I think your church may have been the ones who helped sponsor to maybe our zip code at some time, a mailing. I don't know. Does that sound like something you might have done to help us? And if I'm not mistaken, I noticed I saw one of those books on our neighbor's shelf. She's a sweet little Christian lady across the way. And so we appreciate the ministry here of this institution called the Three Angels Church. I think I read somewhere that we shouldn't let anything get in the way of getting that message out. It should be our priority. So keep up the good work. In let's see here. 2015, Major General Alan Bachelet says that the United States military will be unable to recruit enough qualified soldiers because America has such an obesity problem. And I saw a recent statistic that suggested that we were cutting back 12,000 soldiers. And the reason they were cutting back wasn't that they didn't need the soldiers. It's just that they only, out of 195,000 that they needed, only 72,000 somehow were eligible to join. So you can see, as our text this morning read, there's a thief that's come to destroy and to steal, and he's come up with a lot of various techniques to try to help destroy people's health in one way or another. I think in this little book called Ministry of Healing, how many are familiar with it? I see several hands go up. Interesting, as Seventh Adventists, we have been given great insights, and I believe it's in the book Selected Messages, book 3 on page 346, where it mentions in this little book is contained the wisdom of the great physician. And I thought, boy, I'm a kind of a slow reader, and I think of all these big medical books that I had stacked up. You think, where could you find something that would kind of condense it down to something that's understandable and readable and something that would be a blessing? And I realized, well, God was the one who did that for us. And he put it in words that ahead of time could have been a wonderful blessing and have been a wonderful blessing to many who would take advantage of it. I remember when we were at Loma Linda having the privilege of hosting Dr. Harry Miller, who some of you may have read some of the stories about his work as a pioneer missionary for 70 years out in China. And he was no blood kin to us that we know of, but that's certainly a common name. And a fine fella. He was getting ready to have his 96th birthday. And we were there at the Loma Linda in about 77 is when I graduated. So this must have been about 1975 or 6. And he and his wife, Mary, came over to join us for Sabbath lunch one day. And then in the afternoon, we had a little celebration for his birthday while he shared. And I remember how he described, even then he was still working 20 hours a week or so over at Loma Linda Foods where my brother was involved. And so I had the privilege to go down there, and he demonstrated to us how we could make some soy milk. They fixed us up 13 gallons. I got to carry a jug of it home that he had made, ways he'd kind of devised an old laundry extractor to, get that milk squeezed out and so forth. But you can see he felt like that was one of his best contributions to the world was, when the communist regime had taken over in the 40s over there in China, to be able at Shanghai Sanitarium or wherever to have some of these little orphan babies that had nothing to eat and to be able to fix up some beverage that could be a blessing to the little folks. And so the first little boy that they gave it to that survived with his soy milk, they named him Dojan. And I'm not a Chinese person to speak their language, but I understood that meant bean juice. They named the little boy. So anyway, he was a survivor. So God uses some of the resources he's put and people that he has. And one of the books that Dr. Thrash wrote, I think just before we came to Uchee Pines in 1970s, was a book entitled Eat for Strength. Did anybody ever hear of that little text, that little cookbook, one of the early ones? But, she felt like the Lord had directed her to a Bible verse when she chose that name. And I believe here in Ecclesiastes, the 10th chapter and verse 17 was that little verse. And 10 and verse 17 says here, "Blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles, and your princes feast at the proper time." Feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. You can see, as you don't have to look too hard in a world around us to realize that eating is sort of some people's favorite pastimes. I remember hearing somebody use a word called foodie, and I hadn't gotten familiar with that word, even though I've been into food for a long time. And so I looked up what a foodie was, and they said, well, that's kind of, means something similar like a gourmet, somebody that's really obsessed with eating and fancy foods and what tastes good and so forth. I thought, well, that's kind of like the trend of the times we live in, that whatever tickles our palates. But sometimes this whole idea of overdoing comes real easy for us humans, and we get too much of a good thing and unfortunately too much of bad things as well at the same time. And the role of alcohol itself, that as I understood, over 100,000 deaths a year that are clearly tied to that beverage in our land. And how many folks, it starts with various other habits that may help lay the foundation for that, and inspiration makes it real clear what some of those are. It helps us realize God in his kindness has been thinking, how can we help a world in trouble where the enemy has launched so many pathways? I think the word unnumbered schemes comes to mind, of ways he has to try to take individuals down physically or mentally or spiritually or socially or financially. Or that thief has a lot of different ways he tries to take us out. But the good news, like she shared in the end of the passage there, but I've come to give you life and give it more abundant. How many believe that? Amen. Amen. So you can see this idea of a battle that's being waged. You can see even in there in John 10:10, if you have one part that's a thief and it's trying to destroy and steal and take the sheep, and on the other side you have the good shepherd who's trying to give life and give it more abundant, it looks like we got a real contrast here, two different missions here. One trying to destroy and one trying to restore, trying to bring health, and has promised everything to us. And it makes me think a little bit of that passage in 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, 24 through 27, where the Apostle Paul, in describing 9:24 through 27, he says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body to bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified." Again, you could see this idea of Paul describing how temperance, which of course in Galatians 5 he describes as one of the fruits of the Spirit. We're not naturally temperate at all. The fact that God must have seen fit to have a whole book that's been put together called Temperance lets us realize we've got a problem with this. And you remember, inspiration goes so far as to describe the meaning of that word. This is something that temperance is is staying away from anything that's hazardous and just a judicious amount of that which is good. Of course, Paul's kind of describing, kind of like a world around us. Some people, when they search for health, they're looking for, man, I want something that makes me look good. I get on the front of a magazine or whatever. There's various motivations that people may have. Like he points out, some people run just to get the ribbons, But he says we got a different. We're not just beating the air when we're running. It looks like we try to have strength and health so that we'll be able to preach to others, and that we wouldn't find ourselves obese, and God couldn't use us in His army. So you could see whether it's the United States Army or it's God's army, both armies are going to need some healthy folks to get in there. And so it makes good sense, whatever we can do to take good care of ourselves, it's good for us. But you can see as you look at studies like the Adventist Health Study through the years, I think maybe even back when even before I got to Loma in the 70s, I think it was about 1969 that may have been I heard him lecture one time there, did some of the first research on Seventh-day Adventists with their smoking and lack of it, and the benefits they had to health. And of course, in the last 50 years, there's been hundreds of papers that have been published in the medical literature. And even just this week, I think I saw in the Adventist Review an updated brief describing how the role of being on a plant-based diet. It looks like some real superiority here. And even it looks like hundreds of metabolites that they find in the bloodstream that clearly are linked to benefits in general for a person's health that seem to be present in the plant-based versus the flesh-based menu. And so you can see the notion that God was trying to say, if we didn't know anything about nutrition, but you just had enough strength to read through the first chapter of the Bible that God made you, and then you got to verse 29 and He told you what to eat and said, I've given you every herb that yields seed which is in the face, and every tree, so it'll be your food. So you could see, say, well, boy, it looks like that was pretty plant-based back there. And wasn't it Noah's time that God added meat into the menu for them? And you can't help but think that 912-year lifespan that they had was partly related to that menu. We realize a lot of changes took place after sin came in, and it was certainly a downhill course, but it's pretty amazing how that for 1,600 years, they averaged 900, and then once they added flesh foods in, it dropped 800 years in just 12 generations. To old Abraham said he was a very old man at 175. So to think that flesh foods shorten lifespan, that God made that kind of clear, I think, in Counsels on Diets and Foods, where He said, this He did to shorten man's lifespan. And you think, well, God was trying to shorten our lifespan? And of course, you'd have to look at the big picture from His perspective. His goal is, how can I save the world? And maybe He got to realize, and if we have 900-year-old folks that have turned into terrorists, it's going to be real hard to deal with this issue. If a person has 70 years, 80 years, 100 years to make a decision, which way are they going to go, for me or against me, And so, of course, He's interested in saving the most of us, but it is interesting that of course, science makes it pretty clear now, even animal studies, if we put an animal on a high-protein diet, he grows quick, has babies quick, and then he dies quick. And so we, of course, live in a part of the world that's pretty big on promoting eat more beef, drink more milk, pork is health. This kind of reasoning, goes commonly. A lot of the folks that I still talk with and do these health risk evaluations virtually, you realize that most of them are obviously on a menu that's typical, and I usually just get this one visit with them, but before I finish, I try to leave them with, some points that they could grasp onto. How many here have heard of what they call the 8 laws of health? And I was thinking, well, how could you kind of summarize that for somebody in just a few words? And so I told him, I said, somebody says it's good to eat more beans and greens and watch out for the meats and sweets and treats. That's usually what'll get you. And so I think they all can, catch on to that pretty easily. But that kind of also goes along with with probably the most famous Surgeon General in America. He was the 13th one, Surgeon General Everett Koop. How many have heard that name before? He was the one, I guess, during President Reagan's time. But one of the comments he was quoted as saying that if we pay attention to the fork and the feet and the fingers and sleep and stress, you could see they kind of parallel some of the same principles that God in His kindness would outline for us. The fork, what are you eating and drinking? It's not an accident that she would say the majority of the diseases men suffer from are because of faulty areas of eating and drinking. And the feet, exercise, for every, even 6 minutes of exercise boosts your immune system. If you had a person who just got up every 30 minutes, gets to live longer than the one that just sits all the time. Person that had 30 minutes of vigorous walking, 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, and adds up an average 30 minutes a day or whatever, that cuts your risk of a stroke or heart attack by 50%. And you'd think, wow, my tennis shoes are almost like the old Chinese proverb I heard quoted in the Adventist Review years ago, where it said, every man has two doctors, his left leg and his right leg. So you get the idea that the physical activity is a blessing for us. And yet it also goes along, this inspiration points out, our artificial civilization is at war with nature. And so you'd think, well, we've got those handicapped places that you can drive right up to, and of course it's good if you are using a cane, but people kind of compete to see how close we can get to the closest parking place, and instead of parking as far out as you can and getting a little more exercise and so forth. But escalators and various other devices that we have invented, and like I heard earlier in the day, at least when you had the outdoor toilet, you had a little exercise. My dad said he had a house that was like that. He would build houses for rental properties when we were kids. And he had one that they advertised, instead of 3 rooms and a bath, it was 3 rooms and a path. So you could see even the housework that a person's involved with is therapeutic and counts. We don't have to be an Olympic athlete to be able to start collecting, even though vigorous exercise, maybe not quite as vigorous as he described, that 6-minute wrestling match wouldn't be required. But yeah, the real picture we see, kind of like we saw there in our Sabbath school lesson of Jacob, that his kind of battle of hanging on to the Lord, this is where real power lies. And you can't help but think, if you were just externally looking on and you see old Jacob wandering up to meet his brother Esau, like he was describing, and I get the idea they were both pushing close to 97 years old or somewhere in that age group. So you'd think, well, boy, they're not youngsters. But that he obviously, after having his hip dislocated, gimping up, as like a whipped fella, and here you see the one who hasn't followed the Lord coming in strong, and here he's got his 400 troops with him. From the world's perspective, it looked like old Esau was the one that's been the success story. But then when you look at eternity and you realize, well, it looks like really Jacob chose the path. In his weakness, that turned out to be his strength, and so I think you can see we sometimes in our short-sightedness don't see the picture as God does. I remember many years with patients coming to our institution, and one gentleman who had become a Seventh-day Adventist, he had 4 brothers who hadn't become Seventh-day Adventists, and he, out of all of them, had changed his lifestyle, quit drinking alcohol. He had quit, I think, eating meat and turned into a more healthy lifestyle. And here he was the one that ended up with pancreatic cancer, and his brothers were kind of coming up to visit him, and so forth. And you'd think, well, from a human perspective, it's almost like the story of Job. You'd think, well, God said, this is my favorite man here, and then one bad thing after another happens to him. And so we can't, as humans, sometimes look on the outside and tell what path God is guiding people to, but he is thinking big, and he's thinking of the big picture. 10 extra years of life that is possibly added by changing your lifestyle. And there's abundant evidence, just bukus that has become available, that basically highlights the scientific support for virtually every principle. It's like inspiration points out that nature, or that science never brings anything from its laboratories that properly understood ever conflicts with divine revelation. So if you want to know, even Dr. Nedley used to say this, if you want to know where they're going to find the vitamins and minerals they're going to be selling at the health food store next year, eat your fruits and vegetables, because that's where they're going to find them. So you can go back to your Genesis 1 and you can be pretty safe that there's a lot of goodies still that the Creator has there, and with some good practical common sense and God's Spirit guiding us step by step, that we can be safe in His hands. But I remember when I was on this deferred mission appointment, Dr. Wagner from Loma Linda was representing the General Conference, and he gave us a little plastic ruler, and on that ruler was this little Bible verse from Matthew 10 and verse 8. And why don't we turn to that? It's one that is familiar to us. When Jesus was sending His disciples out, He gave them some advice as medical missionaries. Jesus could have come to this world in any capacity, but He chose to come as a medical missionary. And anyway, He was training His disciples on how to be one. And so here He tells them in verse 8, verse 7, Matthew 10, verse 7, as you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So there was the preacher part. Verse 8, heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Now, even though He gave that to us on the ruler, when I got to some of the classes there in the medical school, I never remember anybody telling us, now when you get out to your community and you set up your practice, heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead. Those are some pretty big orders, wouldn't you say? And, I think sometimes as humans, we just don't think big enough. And we realize, well, is God, we know as you read His Word, there's power in the Word. I was blessed, by, even here, I think page 121, here in this little book, Ministry of Healing, it makes the comment that the physician has precious opportunities for directing his patients to the promises of God's Word. He's to bring from the treasure out things new and old, speaking here and there the words of comfort and instruction that are longed for. Let the physician make his mind a storehouse of these fresh things. Let him learn to repeat the comforting words that Christ spoke during His earthly ministry when giving His lessons and healing the sick. He should talk of the works of healing wrought by Christ, of His tenderness and His love. Never should he neglect to direct the minds of his patients to Christ, the chief physician. And then it goes on to say the same power that Christ exercised when He walked visibly among men is in His Word. In His Word. It was by His Word Jesus healed disease and cast out. By His Word He stilled the sea and raised the dead. And the people bore witness that His Word was with power. He spoke the Word of God as He had spoken to all the prophets and teachers of the Old Testament. The whole Bible is a manifestation of Christ. And so, you start realizing, boy, these promises, if we really believe, really latch onto them, and like Jacob, just hold on and said, I'm not going to turn you loose, Lord, until you do what you promised here. Like it points out, when He said to the paralytic, Son, be of good cheer, thy sins be forgiven thee. When He said to the woman of Capernaum, Daughter, be of good comfort, thy faith hath made thee whole, go in peace. He spoke to other afflicted, sin-burdened ones who should seek His help. Like He was talking to all of us, all the way down to where we are. And knowing the kind of challenges we face in our personal lives, in our physical health, our mental health, our spiritual health, our social situations, it does give us a clue that we have a God that we can trust. Someone who wants us to take His Word more seriously than we ever have. As we approach the end of time, how many here believe we're getting closer to that every day? I do. I believe you don't have people I bump into that don't even seem to have a church background sense something ominous is coming. And even some of those books that you've sent out called Great Controversy, I think there's a place where I recall where she even goes so far as to say some of those books are going to be dusted off and say, I think I remember reading something about this before or hearing about this, and don't think they're going to fall on deaf ears. By some of that time, there may not be some of the internet activities available to people, and some of those paper materials they've got in their hands may be some real valuable resources for some. But I think we need to realize that as God trains his workers, and if every Seventh-day Adventist should be a medical missionary, I would like to appeal to each of you to realize I don't have to go to medical school. I don't have to be a physical therapist. I don't have to be a nurse to be a medical missionary. If I understood that the principles that this great physician has laid out in here for us, how he came to this world as the unwearied servant of man's necessity, and he took our infirmities and he bare our sicknesses that he might minister to every need of humanity. This burden of disease and wretchedness and sin he came to remove. It was his mission to bring to men complete restoration. Came to give them health for the body, peace for the mind, perfection of character. You can see those are still the three big goals that a medical missionary could have today. The person who understands these principles, a person who's a Christian, could take individuals, and as you mingle with men as one who desires their good and win their confidence, like these people that you're sharing at personal ministries time. Oh, you're Adventists. Oh, yeah, we can trust you guys. Give us some of your literature. While we have opportunity to put that in the hands of people, what a blessing we still have. How soon those doors are getting ready to get snipped probably, and we may be just about as popular as the word terrorists one day, who knows, but it's pretty clear that the unique message of God's truth will not be held in high regard by many, and the enemy is, the great controversy is not quite over yet, but God has prophesied that there will be thousands of people all over the world that will hasten from place to place. And even though the enemy will have signs and wonders that will follow his workers, God says there will be signs and wonders that will follow his people that pass out literature. But don't underestimate that, again, even the sanitarium kind of ministry where you can plant the seeds of truth in people's minds about healthful living, and as they see what happens to their physical health, how they gain more confidence to trust you even in their spiritual lives as well. And that many times these natural means that are used in accordance with God's will bring about supernatural results. And I think that picture is one that the average person, I remember even when I was thinking about going into family practice, so the family practice guy, there's about 90% of the diseases of whatever that people come across that you should be able to handle. But I think it was this Dr. Koop pointed out that 80% of the disease in America would go away if people would pay attention to the fork and the feet and their fingers. And so if you knew how to show people how to eat right, get a little exercise, follow some sort of routine in their lives, and the fingers would stand away from tobacco, of course. And so some of those healthy habits that we've been blessed to be showered with, what a privilege it is for us. And I was, no matter how weak we may be physically, how little education we may have, or however our situation is, in closing, I'd like to share a little story. I remember Elder Irwin Gain shared, I think when he was doing a series there at Uchee Pines years ago, and he mentioned during the days of Dwight Moody that there was a little lady in a church who had been praying that Dwight Moody would come to her church. Well, this was before the days, I guess, of, this is when the sailboats went back and forth across. Maybe the steamships, I'm not sure. And at some point in time, this pastor of this church that this lady was praying saw someone he thought might be Dwight Moody at one of the other churches there in London, and asked him, "Are you Dwight Moody?" Yes, he was. And he said, "Would you come over to our church and preach?" And so he, I guess, reluctantly agreed. But on that Sunday morning when he was preaching to these folks, he he said it was like speaking to blocks of ice. There's no response. And so they must have invited him back for a Sunday evening service, and he must have again had a little sermon he shared with them. But at this time asked how many wanted to give their heart to the Lord, and apparently there was a lot of hands went up. So, well, the pastor looked at him like, I've never seen anything like this before. And so they met afterwards downstairs and had a little get together and prayed, and so he went back to his place. I guess he was going to Ireland, and anyway, when he was getting on the boat coming to go back to America, it sounds like they called him and said, Pastor Moody, you have to come back to London to be at our church for a few more days before you go back. And so he came for a few more days, and during that time there were 400 people in that church that decided they were ready to give their heart to the Lord. So he says, what caused this? What caused this? And he said, well, it appears that this one little lady that was crippled wasn't able to come to church, but she knew how to pray, and she was going to pray that God would just send, someone who could help plant these seeds that could stir up a revival in their church and a revival in the community. And so, as our church has their 40 days of prayer, even before the World Session coming up this week, I know today it was that prayer for the Holy Spirit, that it would come upon us, and of course we realize that I am the Lord that healeth thee, and to keep that in mind, that he's the one that does the healing, like he mentions there in Psalm 103, the one that crowns us with loving kindness and tender mercies, delights our mouth with good things to eat, forgives all our iniquities, and heals all our diseases. And you think, wow, I don't know any clinics that have such a wide spectrum of service that they offer like this locally. And so it's good to know that as a Seventh-day Adventist, we have the opportunity to be able to add that spiritual dimension, because you can see how the enemy has worked to separate the medical world in our times from some of the physical and mental things maybe have some rational basis. You think of old George Washington that had his blood taken out of him 200 years ago. He got a bad cold one Friday night and was gone by Saturday night by the time the 4 physicians had worked him over and pulled enough blood out and whatever. So you see that the thought of giving fluid replacement in an IV setting in a hospital is a lot more rational than we were 200 years ago, and we can praise the Lord for those changes, even though, unfortunately, the dependence on the great physician still is a little weak, and most of it's just a little plaque on the wall that talks about mercy or talks about some of these things. But you can see, if it could be embedded in the hearts of each of us, that we could point people to the great life giver. One of the little prescriptions I like to share with people, I have some of you might be interested in a copy. At the top it says prayer clinic, then under there it says urgent care center, then below that says physician, Jesus Christ, master physician. And you can fill this anytime. And of course, his master prescription is the one we all know so well. Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, I'll give you rest. And so that health for the body, health for the mind, health for the soul is more than us humans can offer. But we can, like it says, even a person doesn't have faith, in the arms of our faith, we can lift these people up and say, here's someone who can really help you. So anyway, thank you so much, and we pray that the Lord would help each of us to be those kind of medical missionaries. Don't underestimate your knowledge about healthful living and life. And I remember the story there when we were at Loma Linda. It seems like someone told us, don't underestimate just the sympathizing ear you give to a person, even as a medical student, that you win their confidence. They tell the story of a woman who came in to have some challenging medical problem, whatever it was, and they must have decided she needed surgery. And the specialist who had made the decision and told, of course, there's the specialist, and then there's the generalist, and then there's the resident, and then there's the medical student. They kind of have this tier some of you are familiar with. And I remember someone asked her, well, we're thinking of putting you on the schedule for surgery. Well, before I do that, I want to talk to Dr. So-and-so. She said, who's Dr. So-and-so? Well, come to find out, Dr. So-and-so was the medical student who had spent time listening to him, had won their confidence. And so don't underestimate your ability to still be blessing to people in your neighborhood. So keep up your good work. Thank you again for the privilege to be with you, and maybe we'll join you afterwards for your meal. You know, he delights our mouth with good things, doesn't he?